series where we're actually reading the Sermon on the Mount. And today we're picking up in Matthew 6:19. We read the beginning of Matthew 6 last week. You can start turning there in your Bibles if you're going to follow along. Matthew 6:19 is where we'll be mostly today. And the title of today's message is Secret Rewards. And if you're using an NIV Bible, most of us, I think, in here probably are, they've put like subtitles or they've titled categories of the sermon. And this one is titled Treasures in Heaven. Some of you may have heard about Treasures in Heaven. Some of you maybe not, but that's where we're going to be looking today. And if you're feeling a little nervous that you walked into a church to visit and we're going to talk about money, the truth is we are going to be talking about money. It might be why our pastor's not here today and why she assigned the message to me, but we are talking about money. That is exactly what this is about. And it's an important topic to Jesus, money. It is, and from what I've found, he speaks about the topic of money more than he speaks about the topics of heaven and hell. So if it's important to him, then it should be important to us. So I sort of regret that we sometimes soft pedal that topic. The good news is that I'm not in charge of boosting attendance here, although you ladies helped me out a lot today. Thank you for coming. I can be really honest about this topic, and so I plan to today. And I started digging back to the very beginning of this sermon, kind of to put us in the right place to hear the words today, to be reminded about what the Sermon on the Mount is and prepare our hearts for this message. And I won't have you turn there with me because I actually found when I looked back in some of my old Bibles, and if you have a King James version, you can turn there. I believe it's Matthew 5:1 where the sermon starts. There's a piece, there's one small piece of sentence basically that's included in some older versions of the Bible that have been excluded from the NIV Bibles and the newer versions of the Bibles. When I started looking into it, it turns out that they excluded it because it's sort of redundant. And they found patterns of the usage of this phrase throughout the Bible, and they've kind of discovered, people smarter than me have discovered that it's redundant, it's unnecessary, and they've removed it. But when I read it, it really stuck out to me, and I didn't want to let it go. And if I ever get to sit in the room full of smart people that make decisions like this, I might bring it back up as a matter of conversation. But let me read it to you, and I think Ed has it, so you can follow along up here if you don't have an older Bible. This is the beginning of the sermon. This is where it all starts happening. And seeing the multitudes, he, that's Jesus, went up into a mountain. And when he was set, his disciples came unto him. And he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom in heaven. So the piece that's been removed from your NIV version is, and he opened his mouth. Guess what? When Lumi came up to sing today, she opened her mouth. When Zach came up and did the announcements, he opened his mouth. I just opened my mouth. But if you were going to document the events of this morning, you probably wouldn't write that part down, would you? Of course he opened his mouth. He was getting ready to deliver a message. So why was it noteworthy? And redundant or not, it just jumped out at me. I thought, why did they document that Jesus opened his mouth? And I started to think about our Jesus. And when we read this Bible and we see the things he talks about, we learn that he doesn't waste his breath. Jesus opens his mouth when he has something of significance to say. When he speaks, it's of value. And here this crowd is gathering around him, and it occurs to me that when he opened his mouth, that very act commanded attention from those who were surrounding him. When he opened his mouth, they thought, oh, we want to hear what he's going to say. It reminded me of when I taught preschool. I taught preschool for 6 years. Do not try to recruit me to the children's ministry. It took me 6 years to realize I do not belong there. But when I was a preschool teacher, the ratio was 1 to 25. You know what that means? 1 teacher to 25 4-year-olds. Well, as our instinct would lead us to, when a room full of not 24-year-olds, although it's very similar, I'm sure, just ask Casey, our youth group. When a room of 25 4-year-olds start acting up and getting loud, it's our instinct as teachers and parents to get louder so they can hear us, right? When your teenager is blaring music, mine doesn't, when they're blaring music, it is our instinct as parents to get louder than their music so they can hear us. But I learned a little trick along the way. It took me 6 years. But I learned that actually, when you have a room full of 4-year-olds being loud and obnoxious, what you do is you quiet down. Because when you quiet your voice, they actually have to quiet theirs in order to hear you. And it works. It especially works if they know that what you're saying might be important to them. And it gave me this other visual of Jesus, and I thought, this is probably nothing to do with this message, but it was a cool realization. When we talk about what Jesus did in our life, the radical change that has happened since we started following Christ, we get jacked up. We get excited. We get loud, right? We can't believe it. Because he took from ashes our lives and made them beautiful. I mean, it's amazing. But you think of this Jesus was born into a mission to be a sacrifice to it. He followed that mission. He was sinless. I just kind of think maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to get loud and excited the way we do. He didn't have to use props to keep the attention of the people around him. He was probably soft-spoken, not obnoxious like I'm being now. And so when he opened his mouth, they didn't want to miss what he said. They didn't want to miss the first thing that fell from his lips. Even the first thing that fell from his lips was relevant. It wasn't a rhythm of claps to get their attention. It wasn't flashing lights to get their attention. It wasn't a cool story with great statistics to get their attention. He didn't have to do any of that. He just opened his mouth and they listened. And what did he say? He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom in heaven." What he starts with is where we end up today. It's important. And so I just think if Jesus is going to be speaking this to his believers that are gathered around him, and it's been documented that it's just my honor and privilege to get to read the words that Jesus spoke to you today. I am nothing. He is everything. And these are his words, and all I'm going to do is read them to you now. You can turn there with me. It's Matthew 6:19 is where we pick up. Treasures in heaven. And while you're turning there, I'll just tell you really quickly. When I got this assignment, I had big plans. I go big fast before I go God. It's a really bad habit of mine. And I wanted a whole pirate theme. We were going to go on a treasure hunt together to find our treasures in heaven. I was going to have the follow-along designed with a treasure map. Lumi and her team were going to be dressed like pirates. No kidding. You can ask her. She'll confirm it. It was going to be a big deal. I was going to talk about the Goonies. I don't know if anybody's seen that movie. Somebody was going to win the movie. I had a trivia. Yeah. And then this whole concept that these are Jesus's words, and this feeling that we needed to understand the brevity of what he said hit me. And I just had to take all of that out. I had to take away all the flashy lights. It was just time to just read his words and find them to be relevant in our life. So Matthew 6:19. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will also be. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. See, he's talking about money. I didn't make that up. Okay, I want to get real for 1 second. If I was sitting there as a believer, I'm wondering how long it would take for me to interrupt, because the truth is that Jesus had already spoken for a long time about a lot of stuff and that was relevant in our life and meaningful, and he wasn't done yet. This wasn't the end. But he said something, and I'm almost angry that whoever decided to titled it Treasures in Heaven, because he says it really quickly, something about treasures in heaven, and then he just turns back around and starts talking about other stuff again, right? Like there's one little statement about there being treasures in heaven, and I'm wondering which one of us would be bold enough to say, wait, Jesus, can we go back there? What do you mean, treasures in heaven? What do you mean? Is it jewelry? Do I get diamonds, real diamonds? Is it, for me, endless wardrobe? Or a new pair of shoes every single day? Do I get a castle? How about a nice car? Is that what you want, a nice car? How about unicorns? I always wanted a unicorn. Do we get unicorns? You want a unicorn too? This is what we think. I'm just wondering how nobody stopped him and asked him, like, wait, go back, tell us more about these treasures in heaven. But he doesn't go there. You see, he starts with how we're supposed to behave here. He talks a second about a treasure that we're going to have in heaven, and then he goes back to how we're supposed to behave here. It reminded me of what Wimber refers to, John Wimber, who's the founder of Vineyard Movement, what he referred to as the now and not yet, right? He's talking about eternity. And not scriptural, it's all fawnism here, but I started to think that maybe those things that we call treasure aren't really what we'll expect in heaven. Right? Because what happens here is that we're hungry for something as humans. And we find ways to spend our money to quench that thirst, to satisfy that hunger, but it really doesn't. Because if it did, you wouldn't have to do it again, right? So if it is clothes, and for me it's clothes, I shop at a thrift store and it supports a mission, and so I use it to rationalize my spending. But I don't stop. I mean, every time I walk through the store, I'm buying new clothes, name brand, awesome things I'm so excited to have in my closet. But the truth is like, it makes me feel good for that moment, but then I start getting bored with my wardrobe and needing more. That never, ever satisfies that hunger. Only Jesus can. And so I have a hard time thinking, and I could be very wrong. I'm excited, by the way, to find out what those treasures really are. But I can't help thinking that all those things that falsely and on a short-term basis satisfy us here aren't going to magically become the things that satisfy us later. I have to think that it's really that awe-stricken love, grace, forgiveness, and this concept of eternity that we just cannot wrap our minds around. And what Jesus is talking about is investing now in eternity. If eternity is that treasure, I'm all in. But we're going to invest now in that treasure. And Dave Ramsey, I don't know if everybody's heard about Dave Ramsey. I took a financial peace course of his with my husband, and really great Christian biblical principles attached to this. But he says something. He says, live like no one else now so you can live like no one else later. And I thought about, wow, that's kind of what Jesus is telling us to do here. But when Dave Ramsey is saying it, I think for sure he's saying, be frugal now, downsize yourself now, pay off your debt now so that you can have this financial freedom later. And he's talking about now, still, life on earth. But the difference with what we're reading here is that Jesus isn't saying, do all that stuff now so that later on, while you're here now, you can live in that. He's talking about later, a freedom that comes later. And actually, Ed walked away from the computer, so he won't be able to put the picture up for you. But our children are doing a demonstration that I watched Francis Chan video on. And he takes like 100 feet of rope, right? And he just has this huge amount of rope. And then he colors this much of it on the end red. And he says this 100 feet of rope symbolizes eternity. So there's nothing really there to see. Okay, so that's the picture I picked, not his fault. The 100 foot of rope symbolizes eternity, and that little red piece symbolizes here and now. And that's how much time we have to invest in eternity, good or bad. That what we do in that short window of time has an eternal impact on our lives. We are an eternal beings. And then later on it says that where we pass our treasures, your heart will follow. How true is that? And I think we think it's the other way around, that we invest in what we care about, but we end up caring about what we invest in. It's really true. And I think if we took a poll, and especially with so many guests among us today, and I said, what do you value the most? Probably most of us would say my faith or my family. But if we really did a time audit and a money audit on ourselves, is that really where we're investing? And your heart follows. So that means that when you have the choice, right, between scrolling through Facebook or spending time with your spouse, what you really want to do is scroll through Facebook. I mean, let's be honest. But when you sacrifice what you really want to do right now, that temporarily satisfying act, when you sacrifice that to spend time with your spouse, your heart follows. Same thing's true about your family. Your health and what you eat and what you consume. It feels good right now. But it could ultimately take you from being able to enjoy your family. So when you sacrifice those joys that you're having right now and give it to where you're called to be, that's when your heart follows. That's when God can show up and radically change your life. And he's speaking in terms of eternity. So really what we're supposed to be focused on, because I could spend my life, I did this actually, spent my life valuing family and what a family unit looks like. I was bound and determined to never get divorced. So I did it. I kept my family together. I didn't get divorced. But happiness and joy didn't come from putting them above all other things. Happiness and joy came from putting Christ above all other things, including them. So that when I started sacrificing all these things here that brought me temporary satisfaction and made life look pretty here, and started listening to him and doing what he asked of me out of obedience, everything else just got better. But that's what they're saying about that where you're investing, that's where your heart will follow. So you can't just do what your heartbeat's telling you to do right now. You have to do what's right, even if it's not seemingly the most fun of the selection. In Matthew 6:22, he talks about the eye as the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. He says the eye, not the eyes, the eye. And really just to think about being single-eyed, single-faithed. And later on, he says you cannot serve two gods. And that's true. Right? So if we're going to value and focus on things other than him while we're trying to value and focus on him, we are vulnerable to being led astray. Like by a lot. Like here it says you can't do that. You won't be successfully investing in your eternity if you try to do it that way. Because, like I said, every time you're choosing between those two, you're vulnerable to making the wrong choice. And you get this much time to impact your eternity. How are you going to be spent? I think about Jesus again. Jesus said, Father, spend me however you want. Right? I mean, would you let him spend you the way that Jesus let him spend him? Spend me however you want. How different would our lives be if we said, Father, spend me however you want? What would he be asking you to do with your time? What would he be asking you to do with your finances? As I was preparing for this message, every time I walked through that stinking thrift store, I was like, oh, I could feed somebody with that money. I mean, it started to, if we really asked him, God, how do you want to spend me? I think we would be shocked that even as good as we are, we're not there yet. I think we'd be shocked. I prayed and asked God to give me a vision for this message. And I thought he got it wrong at first, to be honest. I got this vision of being like in a waiting room of a hospital or a doctor's office or something. And it was really gray. The people were gray, the scenery was gray, and people were sitting there and they were disabled and sick and just, slumped over. And at first when I got this vision, I thought, oh my gosh, I need to get them to the church. I need to get them to the church because there they'll hear the pastor talk about Jesus. They'll have hope. We can bring them up to the the cross, and we're going to pray for them. And they're going to be healed. And I felt like I heard a little giggle come from God. You know when kids take something figurative and they say something about it and you realize, oh, they're taking that literally. And you get that kind of chuckle, that moment like you're like, oh, I never thought that they might have taken that seriously. My grandpa told me that I kicked his leg once on accident, and he said, that's okay, I've got a wooden leg. I still don't know what the heck that means, but I spent my whole life thinking my grandpa had a prosthesis, but he didn't. He had their real legs, and even I saw him in shorts, it never clicked, but I think the moment I said it out loud, I remember my dad kind of chuckling, like, oh, Fawn. And that's what I felt like when I was like, I have to get these people to the church, that God giggled a little and he says to me, no, Fawn, they are the church. They are the church. And I'm like, well, what's that have to do with this message? We know what it has to do with this message. Jesus sat down, believers gathered around him, and he preached a sermon. That's the church. Sound familiar? He was setting up church, and he was telling us how to get on as church folk, how to get on as people, how to get on as his body, as his bride. He was telling us what to do next. Why would he tell us what to do next? Jesus does not waste his breath. He told us what to do next because he knew we were going to get it really wrong. And if you keep reading, you find the church didn't get it right. And they probably got it wrong again and again and again. They had to get letters from people saying, hey, don't you remember what Jesus said? And, oh boy, I know that I crowned some of you servant leaders. I know our pastor boasted about how awesome this church is last week, and it's true. We're good soil. There's good folk here. If I pulled up the frontliners, if I pulled up the people who have been fighting for Naples Vineyard through 3 pastors, you would see their wounds. You would see their scars. This is a good church, but I wouldn't be your friend. I wouldn't be your sister if I didn't say, we're not getting it all right just yet. And I'm going to give you like a hugely hypothetical scenario to kind of depict that. So it's so grossly misaligned with any one of you. Not one of you is going to walk away going, she's talking about me. So you come, you sit down here, we passed around the offering basket, right? You put your money in it. Basically, you paid your dues. You invested in having that door held open for you this morning and greeted with Nancy's smile. You invested in Yolita proudly handing you a donut, a banana, and a hot cup of coffee. You came in here and you found your seat. Some of you didn't get the seats that you paid for. I'm one of those people that have to sit in the same seat every time or I get, ugh. But you paid for your seat, you find your seat, you pick the same seat that you sit in every week, and you sit down and you hope that you're going to experience the most amazing concert. Lumi and her team are up here, and man, did they nail it today. Man. And you're going to sit back and enjoy the show, and the pastor walks up, and you hope she doesn't say something disgusting at the pulpit, because you didn't pay for that. Just warning, disclaimer, if you come to this church, the pastor will say something disgusting at the pulpit. There's times when I sit there and I'm like, oh, did she really just say that? And you poor people who invested in coming to Naples Vineyard to hear the pastor preach, because she is amazing, and you got stuck with me. We all fall into that hypothetical scenario at some level in some ways in our life. Not one of us is that person I described, but all of us are that person sometimes. I know it because I see it in myself and I've seen it in others. And when you leave here after a service and you start critiquing the message and you start critiquing the worship and you start critiquing the way we called people to prayer or how you were prayed for, and you start critiquing those things, you are that person because you're all about you. And you're trying to decide if you got your money's worth, if you spent your time well. And I know that people do this. I sat with a woman who decided to leave the Vineyard Church, go find another church, and people do that. You know, they church shop, and this couple came here, and they were checking us out, and she said, I've just decided we're going to go somewhere else because there's not enough people our age in the church. And I was sitting there 20 years older than her and not the pastor and not responsible again for attendance. So I was very honest and I said, that's great, that's fine, but I'm begging you to take some responsibility and to understand that when you go to the next church, your troubles will follow you. Because if there's not enough people your age in our church, that's your fault. Because they're not coming to me to get to the church. I'm not attracting people 20 years younger than me to the church. But to have some responsibility to your church, because the church that Jesus is setting up here isn't in the walls. It's not in the building. It's not in the tithing. It's not in the numbers, the attendance. We're part of a really big church, His church. And we all have a responsibility to where He's brought us. If your butt is in the seat today, the enemy didn't put it there. There is a reason it's there. It's because you're supposed to be part of something bigger. Just look where He's moving and participate in it. And have some responsibility to your church. And we had a couple leave that they left for their own personal reasons, but a bunch of us in the congregation reached out to them. But they'll continue to say that the church never reached out to them because the pastor didn't reach out to them. We have some responsibility as individuals, as part of the church. We are the church. We are the church. It makes me think of a song we sang. Thank you to the worship team for learning that song, because the words are so powerful. He's calling us to be the church. And it's time for this church to invest in eternity the way He's called us to. Like we are fasting, right? We're praying, we're being obedient. It's like we read the how-to and then we put it into place and then we check back and go, did it work? But He's calling us to something much bigger than that, to hearing Him speak to us, to being obedient, to being the church. And I think the part that we leave out happened right here. We leave out bringing Him into it. Let's hear Jesus speak to us. Let's ask God to use us that way. He'll take care of attendance and numbers and dollars and buildings. Let's ask Him to participate in building His kingdom here. Let's call him into that with us, and let's pull together. And honestly, here's the thing I'm going to say, one last thing about church. I do love our church. We're good soil, so forgive me if you feel a little beat up. We're really good soil. But until we see more people at our outreach reaching into a community that needs us than we do sitting here on Sunday morning, we're not hearing Jesus talk. We need to come together to serve the people he's calling us to serve.